Okay, so I believe this is the seventh video lecture on the topic of social class in the United States. We were just talking about social mobility. We're going to move on now and talk about poverty. So poverty, okay, this is an important point, is the definition or how the poverty line is calculated, I do not believe is in the OpenStax textbook. So you want to listen closely because this is an exam question. The official poverty line is based on the price of food. Now, it's established during President Johnson, so the official poverty line becomes official in the 1960s, and it takes what they called an emergency food budget. So it's actually established by the Department of Agriculture, decides what is a basic diet for Americans, like an emergency. We're not talking about steaks and shrimp. We're talking about your basic necessities based on what people ate in the 1950s. Okay, so what people ate in the 1950s, it calculated the cost of this emergency food budget, and then it assumed here's where it gets even more tricky. It assumed that people spent one third of their household income went to food. So the assumption is one third is for food, one third goes to housing, and then the other third goes to everything else. So this is another kind of interesting point. If you ever hear people talk about affordable housing, or if you get a mortgage, things like this, in order for that house to be considered affordable for you, it must be one third, no more than one third of your income. So recently, I was looking for a rental, and in order to be eligible to rent in that place, my income had to be 3 times what the rent was, and that's because that's what the federal guidelines say is considered affordable housing. So the answer here, defining the official poverty line is based on the price of food based on of what people ate in the 1950s. But it's assumed that you spend only one third of your budget on food. Now, here's the reason that the poverty line doesn't get updated. It gets changed every year to reflect the cost of inflation of those food items, but it doesn't get adjusted. So the reality is that today people probably spend a fifth of their income on food. So if I was to adjust that to one fifth on food, say one third on housing, what would effectively happen is the threshold for poverty would go up. It would mean the poverty line would be higher, and overnight more people would be poor. And no politician is going to want to do that, right? No politician is going to want to recalculate the poverty line so that more people are poor. So it stays the same, and it's completely outdated and totally wackadoodle and hard to calculate. But nonetheless, right there is what the guidelines were in 2004. So if a person were to apply for any sort of social benefit program, this is the calculation that they would use. They calculate it based on one person, and then there's some sort of wacky adjustment per person. So in a household of 4 people, you are not officially poor until you earn less than $30,000 a year. The myth is, so here's another important question: who is poor? The myth says that it's like urban men, right? Urban black men, if you think of what our culture tells us. But in fact, the most likely person to be poor are women who live in rural places. This is what we call the feminization of poverty. The feminization of poverty is the disproportionate number of women who are poor, who have children, but the disproportionate number of rural women. So a single mom who lives in rural Saline County is more likely to be poor, is the most common image of poverty in America, feminization of poverty. Children, yeah, well, we'll just sort of leave that one off, because children, like, it would mean that if a mom was poor and she had 2 kids, it'd mean there were more two kids, and that starts to get kind of complicated. The difference between absolute and relative poverty, this is mentioned in your OpenStax textbook. Absolute poverty is going without your basic needs. Relative poverty is when we compare ourselves to the people that are around us. So you'll hear people say, well, a poor American is not poor compared to a poor person in Sudan. Well, that is absolutely true. A poor rural woman probably has more creature comforts than a person that lives in Sudan. But the question is we're still in the wealthiest country in the world, and if everyone else is surrounding us has these resources, why do we also not have those resources? It is true that poor Americans have more than poor people in other parts of the world, but that's not doesn't matter because we are comparing ourselves to our neighbors, and our neighbors' lives are different than ours, and there are plenty of resources in this country to go around. Why are people poor? Okay, so this harkens back to another slide when we started talking about theory. The typical explanation in our culture is that people are poor because of something they have done wrong. They have chosen not to get an education, they're addicted to drugs, they're lazy, they have poor work ethics. That's what we call an individual explanation. And certainly there probably are people who make choices to keep themselves poor. But sociologists are going to focus on the structural. Remember, we're all about the structure, not the individual. From a sociological perspective, the individual doesn't exist. The social structural explanation says that the reason that people are poor is because the jobs pay low wages and the jobs available to people in certain places are not enough, are not adequate to provide basic needs. So the reason that moms are more likely to be poor in rural America is because there are no jobs in rural America, and the jobs that are available are probably low wage. There are fewer options for daycare. There's fewer options for transportation. You could have the most strongest work ethic and be highly educated. If there is not a job for you to work at, you're not going to be working, not because you're poor. So this theory says that it's society, it's a structure, it's features of society that keep people poor. It also speaks to the theory about the people at the top make the rules and make the policies, right? That the jobs don't pay livable wages. There's not enough jobs available. Maybe the job requires a skill that I don't have, and there's nowhere around here for me to get it, or I can't afford to get that training, or there's no childcare, or there's no public transportation, or maybe I don't know the right people to get my name on an application. Or maybe I have a record, right? Some places refuse to hire people who have convictions. So again, I think this might be a quiz question too, is offer a structural explanation for why people are poor. Individual says people are poor because they've done something wrong, but the sociologist is going to focus on the structural explanation that if all jobs paid a living wage and there was a job for everyone, we probably all would be earning living wages. I tried to update this map, but I could not find an update. Chances are the pattern is pretty much the same. But what it is intended to reflect is the percentage of poor people per county. I live in Riley County, which has one of the darker colors. We have a higher poverty rate, and that sometimes is reflected in the number of people who are students and earning low wages. So you could argue it's a wee bit distorted, but there are a lot of people who live in Riley County who don't earn livable wages. Where is Saline County? Saline is one of these two in here, a lot lower, and then way out here. But anyway, so that's what that you can go to here. It's kind of a fun little map. You can compare all kinds of variables. Another important concept that's not in your OpenStax textbook, but it is in some of my other textbook, is something called the Horatio Alger myth. And you're probably familiar with this idea. And this idea, it harkens back to the individual explanation and basically said that it's a myth that we live in a culture of opportunities. Everybody has equal opportunities, and all you have to do is take them. And sociologists are going to argue that that is a myth. Well, we might all have opportunities. Those opportunities are not equal. Yes, we all got up this morning and we chose what we were going to put on, but some people went to their closet and had 15 pairs of pants, and some people had two, right? That is not equal opportunity. Some people come with structural barriers. Maybe their education was substandard, so they don't have the same access to college attainment. They both have the chance to go to college, but some people grew up in a place where they had adequate education and another person didn't. Not because of anything that they have done, just by the luck of their birth, right? So this myth is yeah, what does it say? Most people believe, what is it? Most believe everyone has an above average chance of success. This reminds me of, it's a PBS story. Anyway, above average chance of success, which is impossible because average is based on, yeah. So we get some other examples of this Horatio Alger myth. I like to ask students when we're together if they like the movie Pursuit of Happiness. Willy Wonka, the idea that this kid gets the golden ticket, he just was lucky. Slumdog Millionaire, Rocky, Forrest Gump, but they're all based on this Horatio Alger myth that we can all succeed. And the sociologist is going to say, nope. It's going to really depend on where you're at in the structure. It's going to be a whole lot easier for these people to succeed. Now, we all do have opportunities, and I'm not going to deny that, but those opportunities are not necessarily equal. All right, friends, this wraps up the chapter on social class in the United States. The next chapter will probably be global stratification. We'll talk a little bit more about some of these same concepts, but in the global context. Thank you for listening.